Everybody, thank you so much for joining us for the Skill Builder webinar this afternoon, How to Facilitate the Practitioner Data Use Workshop with the REL Workshop Toolkit. It's hosted by the Urban School Improvement Alliance. And at this time, I would like to introduce Kayleen Cook, who is the researcher for the Urban School Improvement Alliance. She'll be kicking off today's webinar with a few words about the Alliance and also introducing our speakers this afternoon. So good afternoon, Kayleen.
Thank you, Peter. So welcome everyone to the Practitioner Data Use webinar. As Peter mentioned, this is sponsored by the Urban School Improvement Alliance. And this alliance helps to build capacity among its members to use and access data to address questions around improving low-performing schools. So the Urban School Improvement Alliance members are interested in examining school performance within larger social, organizational, and instructional contexts. So I would now like to welcome today's webinar presenters. Candace Baccala is a research associate with WestEd, where her work includes designing professional development workshops to support educators with data use. She has worked with schools and districts directly as a data coach and has also supported state-level policymakers to use an improvement process to improve results for students with disabilities. Her other work includes studying the impact of educator evaluation systems and evaluating professional development. Nancy Gerzon is a senior program associate with WestEd and works with superintendents, principals, coaches, and teacher leaders to analyze data to build internal capacity and to develop strategies for sustained improvement. She provides professional development to district and school teams to implement internal systems that include the use of data as a lever for improving both school and district systems and classroom instruction. In recent years, Nancy has focused on training teacher leaders to align standards, instruction, and assessment, and supporting teachers to use daily evidence of learning to guide instruction. So I will now hand the presentation over to Nancy.
Thanks, Kayleen, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you joining us for this Skill Builder workshop. It's an interesting workshop, and I think Peter did a great job explaining the idea that it's very meta, a word I don't like to use all that often, but it really frames out an opportunity for you to think about how you might use some resources that we've developed for the regional lab around using data. And in particular, we're going to describe what's in the Practitioner Data Use in Schools Workshop Toolkit and talk specifically about some of the structure of that and also some of the templates and tools that can be used as you do the workshop itself. We're going to spend a fair amount of time in the middle of the presentation today framing in some issues around facilitating teams that would be working on this and how to organize and structure both the protocols themselves and then also how to think about how to organize folks in your district or schools to use these materials as best as possible. And then really have an opportunity to ask some guiding questions and take a look about what other kinds of resources might you need to run this workshop in your district. I think when I think about this particular webinar, the one piece that's not necessarily noted there and I really want to keep in mind is that one of the most important things about using these resources to lead data use sessions in your school or district is really thinking about what parts of these materials will work really well for us, what parts might build on existing foundational knowledge of data work that we've done in our schools already, and what parts might be too elementary for us or more advanced. So thinking about how this work would apply in your district is a high dream for me that you get out of this as well, that you're able to look at some of these resources and tools from that perspective, knowing that a lot of work in data use has been done and is in various stages of development for many of you. The other thing I'll say about this is that as you listen to us talk about the materials themselves, it's important to know that exactly for that reason, that when we go out to schools and districts, we find folks in very different stages of development, that Candace and I will adapt these resources for use in specific settings. So as you're looking at these resources, know that they're a starter kit for work that you might want to do, and that there's lots of ways. It's not meant to be a plug-and-play kind of workshop, but it's an opportunity for you to think about what are some of these resources that would work really well for us, and how might I adapt some of the protocols or activities to work better in my district. So our agenda will look like this. In just a moment, we're going to have an opportunity to hear from Kim Nugent, who, as Peter mentioned, is a data practitioner. She runs data teams out of the Capital Region BOCES in New York, and she'll have an opportunity to explain her role and the work that she did in particular that we've asked for her to talk about. Is we led this workshop in her region, and so she'll have a chance to talk about why she chose to bring this workshop in and what are some things that have happened as a result of that work. We'll then have an opportunity to hear about the toolkit itself, so what's in the toolkit, how is it structured. We'll move into some work around effective facilitation, and I'll close us off by talking about how to think about successful outcomes for this work in your school or district. During the way, we encourage you to ask questions in the chat and to have an opportunity to get feedback on certain things that you're wondering about. We will have some polls and also some opportunities for Q&A and discussion during the workshop setting itself, during the webinar, but please also feel free to have those questions coming to us as we go, and we'll do our best to answer them. And finally, as I close up on this section, I just want to say thank you to those of you who sent questions in advance, and we have looked at those and incorporated them into some of our comments. So we'll hold on to those as well, but if something comes up that you're feeling a need to answer, definitely put that in the chat as well. So let me welcome Kim Nugent and ask her to introduce herself. She has a very interesting and diverse job, and we're very pleased to have her here to share her story around using these materials. Kim?
And thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. So as Nancy said, my name is Kim Nugent, and I'm an instructional data coach with Capital Region BOCES. And a BOCES is a Board of Cooperative Educational Services. And in New York, there are 37 BOCES, and what we do is we provide shared educational programs and services to school districts. Cap Region BOCES provides services to 23 different districts, and very diverse. We span 4 counties in the Albany area, and we have rural, urban, suburban schools, so we definitely run the gamut of student needs in our BOCES. So that's a little bit about me, and my role as a data coach was initially created under Race to the Top, and with the goal of providing data coaching services to participating school districts. And the way this worked was the districts would get days allocated throughout the year based on, I guess, how much they contributed to the pot, the Race to the Top pot of money. And the data services really run the gamut as well. You know, it could be anywhere from analyzing state test results, doing some work with third-party testing. I do a lot of work with NWEA data, and working on trying to come up with, formative assessments, or just, better assessments in general, and analyzing the data associated with those assessments, creating data teams, working with PLCs. So it is a very diverse role, and every day is different, and it really depends where I'm going on any given day. Our model is a little bit different now that Race to the Top is over. So, we're constantly evolving our data services as we, I guess everything evolves with the Race to the Top and different funding streams. So I guess I'll talk about what we did in my area. Is I participated in a countywide workshop with 5 school districts, and it was focused primarily on 5 of our rural school districts. And what we did is we brought representatives from each district to the district who was hosting the workshop, and we decided that this would be a nice way to bring them together so they could hear a similar message. We wanted them to be able to work within their districts, but also have conversations with each other regarding, data and how you analyze it. This was definitely the first step in the right direction. This was about 2 years ago now, and it really has facilitated a much better, I guess, use of data. There seems to be less fear of data, I'll just say. And in fact, I was at one of our participating districts last week, and they've really have come a long way, and they're asking for data to look at now, and that's a really nice change. So that was why we decided we wanted to bring everybody together. And as this was now 2 years ago, so as we reflect on it, there's still definitely a lot of work to do. So we've learned that districts really need protocols and frameworks to help guide them. As we all know, time for this is very limited, and whatever little time we have, we want it to be productive. And found that protocols certainly help to keep conversations focused and productive. So, districts have adapted some of the resources from REL. Some districts have come up with their own protocols, but I'm definitely seeing more of a use of protocols as they talk more and more about data. What I find, it's great when you get them talking and they have a protocol, but what they struggle sometimes with are the next steps. So the reminding our teachers and administrators that, this is a cycle. So we have to keep looking at data. We have to keep talking about it. It's not a one-time shot where you talk about it and then you're done. They're good at sharing their observations, but they're still struggling with the now what. So if there's a standard that is showing as a weakness, what do we do? And I find that is something we need to continually work on. And then when we come up with a strategy, how do we measure? How do we come back to the table and talk about it again and decide, is this working? Are we seeing improvement? And finally, they want the data to tell them what to do. And this is where coaching becomes really important. I'm a data coach. However, we do have an instructional ELA and an instructional math coach. So we become a pretty good team because I can help with the data analysis piece, but then I can hand that over to my math coach or my ELA coach, who can then really work on those next steps and those strategies and trying to bring the groups back together to talk about what's working and what's not working. So the coaching becomes a pretty important piece of the data cycle. And I think that's all I have as far as my reflections on what we did, but it's still a work in progress, but I have to say in the past 2 years I've seen a lot of growth in really all of my districts when it comes to using data and starting to value data and how we can help kids by analyzing the data.
Hi, everybody. This is Candace Baccala. Thank you so much, Kim, for doing that overview of your perspective from the field. We will bring Kim back to have some reactions at the end of the webinar today, and also she will be available to help answer your questions since she is actively doing this work, as we know many of you are as coaches or as professional development providers. And so we really appreciate her taking the time. So as Kim mentioned, this workshop was delivered with a set of districts that she works with. And it's also been delivered in several other locations around the Northeast. We've gone to rural Maine and urban New Hampshire, as well as more urban districts in New York. We've also delivered it to different audiences, such as special educators here in Massachusetts, for helping them think through how to apply it to their settings. For the toolkit itself, it was created from a review of research in terms of best practices with data use, guidance from funded centers from the U.S. Department of Education, and also practitioner materials that we have learned from and used over the years. Since, as Nancy Gergon says, there is a lot of work out there now about data use. So what we tried to do was to package it together in an easy-to-use facilitator guide that had links to handouts as well as slides that could be customized for different audiences. It is also linked to a self-paced online workshop, as Peter mentioned, in the pre-webinar material. And you can access both of those resources from the link on the slide or the download pod, which you see below the slides here. And what's nice about them is they are free and publicly available. So the intent is that you access them and use them, customize them to your settings. So we'll just move to a really quick poll here just to get a sense of people's familiarity with the toolkit. Take a moment and let us know how many people have downloaded and read the guide, downloaded it but maybe not looked at it yet, maybe haven't read through it at all, or actually have used it in professional development or other work. We would love to just see where you are. Okay, it seems like half of those responding have downloaded it but haven't looked at it yet. Hopefully that means maybe as you're sitting here, you're downloading it and looking at it, or plan to look at it just after the webinar. Quite a few of you, 35%, have not yet downloaded it, which is fine. This is an introduction, and maybe you'll be inspired to do so. And then 9 of you, 17%, have downloaded and read it. So that's great. We would love to hear feedback, questions, anything that's come up for you as you have done the work. So we'll move now to the next. The materials contained in the toolkit itself are a facilitator guide, which has the kind of talk out loud. If you are a coach or a professional development provider or a teacher, you're used to these kinds of guides. They walk you through the activities. They provide recommendations for language to use, discussion prompts and questions to use, and they talk a little bit about how to frame the different discussions and protocols. There is also a set of handouts which participants can fill out. You can photocopy them and then run them off electronically or on paper. And it also comes with a set of slides, and these are the generic slides that can be customized. So it has diagrams and discussion prompts, but it doesn't have any specific information about a district or a region, so you can go ahead and insert the context that is important for your setting. This is an example of one of the handouts that's most frequently used from this workshop. If you download the toolkit, it's at toward the very end, and it's called the Personal Data Plan Template. The Personal Data Plan Template is essentially a set of guiding questions that are aligned with each step of the inquiry cycle. So you can see here the first step is to seek information, and there are a set of questions that the participants will walk through. So what standards or content do we want to focus on? Why are these important? And then what questions can be answered by looking at data? One of the comments or questions in the registration list that we received from a participant ahead of time was, when you have so much data to look at, how do you know where to focus? How do you know what to select? Because teachers can get easily overwhelmed. And this toolkit advocates for starting with a question-driven approach. So when you bring people together to look at data, you start with that question and having them define what question they want to explore before they start looking at the data. If they just sit down and begin looking at data without a question in mind or without a purpose for looking, they can go off in different places. They can make observations that might not be tied to their area of focus. So that's one just recommendation to address one of your questions out there in the field. How do you focus the data analysis? Start with an area of focus or a question before having them take a look at that data. And I'm sure many of you who are coaches have other ideas as well, so please feel free to put those into the chat. So I just wanted to go through a few of the key concepts in the workshop that are reinforced. It's important to note this webinar is not going to walk you through every element of the toolkit. It's really more to give you that big picture view. But one of the key concepts that we really want to reinforce is the idea that data inquiry happens in phases within a cycle. And there are questions that align with each phase, but each cycle is only useful if you can complete all of the steps. I think sometimes in education we have a tendency to do part of the cycle. So perhaps we sit down at the table, we do some data analysis, but then there's no discussion or connection to those instructional next steps. Or if we have that discussion, it's cut short, and there's no returning to the original question that was put on the table to find out how did we do with that instructional practice that we thought we were going to try. So if you don't complete the whole cycle, then data inquiry can feel scattered. It can feel piecemeal. And I think that's the reaction for many practitioners in frustration of why are we looking at this data. So the workshop reinforces the concept of the cycle. Another one of the key concepts is the idea of having structured routines. Sometimes when we've worked with practitioners, we get a little bit of anxiety about all the protocols and the structure that's put into the workshop. Why do we need so much structure? Can't we just sit down and look at this data and talk about what comes to mind? I think that the reason routines are helpful is that if you don't have to focus on what's coming next, if you have a predictable routine, you can really pay more focus to the content at hand. And the protocols are intended really to get everybody's participation. They're intended to solicit different points of view. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about facilitating protocols. But the other thing we'd like to reinforce is that having a structured routine helps you move through the cycle purposefully instead of in that scattered way. And then the last key concept that we reinforce is that assessment literacy covers a lot of different topics, but it includes interpreting data responsibly and accurately. So being able to look at data and draw conclusions that are reasonable, accurate, responsible, and not based on speculation, but also linking those inferences to the action. So not just having data literacy, not just, having test literacy, not just looking at one test and knowing what that test says, but being able to say this assessment can help me understand this level of skill for these kinds of students and what I'm going to do next as a result. So we really want to build assessment literacy through the toolkit. And this is an example of the inquiry cycle that we use in the toolkit. Again, there are many different types of data cycles out there in the world. This is just one example that comes from the National Forum on Education Statistics. And that is another publicly available resource that you can download from the U.S. Department of Education. But it has 5 steps, and we go through these steps very purposefully with the audience as we move through the day. When we've done this workshop, we've usually done it between about 5 to 6 hours. And, of course, we have lunch, and so it fills up a school day. But by the end of that day, the participants will have practiced with all 5 steps. They might not have gotten through each step in its entirety. So, for example, step 4, which is take instructional action and then evaluate your results, they are not able to do that, but we do have conversation about what actions they might take and then how might they gather data to evaluate it. So even though they haven't actually gone and done anything different, they at least know that those 2 steps close out the cycle.
So we're going to ask that you complete this poll. Candace just mentioned the idea of doing this as a full day workshop, but we've also set up the guide to think about different ways to do this over time or even online, and the guide offers all three of those. And if you could take a moment to fill out this poll, it'll give us a sense of where to put some emphasis points as we move forward in the workshop. So thanks to those of you who are completing that, and we'll just give a second more for that because there are different pros and cons for doing this in different ways and thinking about that. So it looks like the majority of folks, we're changing as we talk. I'll have to wait another moment. I can no longer say what I was about to say as majority. Yeah, interesting. So it looks like the greatest number so far have said that they would be likely to do this at a full day in-person workshop, and then others, almost equal amount, are talking about doing this in a workshop over time. And a few as well, 10 people so far, have said they'd be interested in doing this in webinars. And as we talk about the webinar session, I just want to add, for those of you who weren't on during the lobby session when Peter was talking, there is a short online version of these materials that's available through the REL website, and I believe that that is posted in the chat. And if not, Kayleen can put that a little bit up close so you can see that in the chat at this time. So when we do this workshop, we've done it both full day in person and several days over time and through coaching sessions. And the benefit of doing the full day in person is very much geared around the fact that teachers can experience a full inquiry cycle and work through the entire process. So they're not kind of left hanging out there and organizing around that. And I'll let Jenny put this back to our slides. But the benefit of days over time is that there's an opportunity for facilitators to work more closely with teachers around developing and internalizing some of the skills over time that are necessary, especially around the use of protocols and kind of taking an inquiry stance. And that can be done a little bit in the one-day session, but we find also that over time that really shifts the way that teachers think about it. And so I think our best approach, and we've done this in several places as well, is the both-and model, doing a full day on site where everybody has a chance to really engage in the process itself, and then working through different segments of that process over time with some other data sets. Many of the questions that we get as thinking about folks being ready to do this have to do with the facilitation of this work. And in particular, we just want to point out a few things around the role of the facilitator in organizing and supporting this work over time. The primary role that facilitators play in data analysis, as is set up in this inquiry guide, and we would say in other settings as well, is to promote equity and participation so that all voices can be heard in the data analysis process. And that's typically done through the use of protocols. It can be done in a variety of other ways in the agenda as well. But in this workshop, we've really set that up from the framing of the use of protocols. This concept of having everybody have a very structured way to analyze the data and to review the possibilities of what to do about those results, so there's protocols on both sides of that equation, is helpful in a number of different ways in terms of giving people voice in the work that's being done and allowing people to connect it to their own work. Also, ensuring that the focus stays on track towards analysis of the particular issue that's on the table that the inquiry question is guiding. One of the greatest challenges in data teams that I've seen in schools is an inability to kind of stay with the topic. Oftentimes we'll start looking at data and then a team will go off and say, oh yeah, but I did this here and this happened there and this was that. And rather than talking about the data, you're suddenly talking about something quite different. So the protocols are really designed to help facilitators stay on topic and focus on those guiding questions that are driving the work. A second major role that the facilitator plays over time is helping to build the understanding of what an inquiry stance looks like in data use. And by repeatedly focusing teachers on a set of questions that they want answers to, a set of issues that they want to solve, this really changes the conversation in data use from a problem set a problem focus to a solution focus. And facilitators can really help by reflecting back to that inquiry question, using the protocol to help guide that solution-focused approach and keep people focused on those next steps. From a bigger perspective, the facilitator really serves as kind of a documenter over time. And in this particular work, there's one piece not on this slide that's an important work for the facilitator that Candace will describe in just a minute around getting the data ready for the team to use during the inquiry cycle. So sometimes in that inquiry cycle, we even ask teachers to come up with their questions in advance so we know what data to prepare and bring as facilitators, which can be very effective in getting the group started in the process. So facilitators play all of those roles in thinking this through and organizing around really thinking what are those supports that we can give to teachers so that they have these successful opportunities for continuous reflection and thinking about ongoing improvement. So let me turn this back to Candace. She's going to share 3 examples of protocols that we're using in the toolkit. And as Candace mentioned earlier, one or more of these might be familiar to you because we did go to public sources to get these and intentionally chose to use some of the tools that people are familiar with. Candace?
Yes, thanks, Nancy. Before I go on, I would actually like to just pause and get some interaction on the chat since it's been pretty quiet, and we really would love to hear your questions and comments. And I want to start with that comment, or this question that I posed about what do you find helpful from a good facilitator? When you know a facilitator is doing a good job, how does that help move along? Or how do you know when it's good facilitation from the work that you've done or from the coaching you've done with other people trying to help them be good facilitators? What do we think about that? I see some people are typing. I've observed that in my work with schools, facilitation is a very complex skill, and many new teachers especially have come out of either teacher preparation programs where this was not really talked about, the idea that as part of your role as an educator, you are going to be facilitating your peers, facilitating adults in conversations. I think new teachers think a lot about facilitating discussions with students, with young people, but it's sort of a surprise that what's changing these days as we get into professional learning conversations and team meetings where you have to be a good facilitator with other teachers. And so one thing I'm seeing here is that a few of the qualities of a good facilitator are having everyone feel valued, sharing their opinions. This person could also have a solid base for instructional decisions, so having a facilitator with content knowledge, having somebody who is able to help the team make instructional decisions. What's hard is, it sounds like from Diane, what's most challenging is varying comfort levels. So if other people on the team may have different levels of comfort with data, how do you help them manage, how do you as a facilitator manage all of those levels? From Fred, hi Fred, didn't know you were going to be on today. I know Fred from some other work. Somebody who steers us back from the main path from the bunny trails. Yes, having a good facilitator can help you stick to the agenda. And the idea that the facilitator shouldn't be so rigid that they don't allow for conversation where conversation is necessary, but certainly if the conversation is veering off, you need to pull them back to the agenda. Sarah, a good facilitation skill is paraphrasing. Summarizing, paraphrasing. That can be a contribution that the facilitator can have just to sum up where we are. Tosin's idea is a facilitator helps you walk away with something. So moving to action or coming to some conclusions at the end of a meeting, the facilitator's job might be to document what those are. Just to go back to this previous slide here, this idea that the facilitator plays multiple roles, one of them could be the documenter or the historian who keeps track of where you were last time and where you need to go the next time. And then Heather reinforcing the idea of honoring those different perspectives, because that can really move your conversation, where instead of one person dominating the conversation, you have those multiple voices, and hopefully your discussions are deeper and richer. So that's another facilitation skill. You're welcome, Tosin, for saying her name perfectly, his name perfectly. I'm sorry, I couldn't tell. So tips for facilitating the protocols. The inquiry cycle sort cards is one of our protocols, and we're going to go through 3 of them just in this short webinar. So one of the activities we start with is having the participants look at a blank cycle, and in front of them they have some steps for the inquiry cycle that are already printed out and on their table on small index cards. And then we ask them to sort those cards into what they think is representative of an inquiry cycle. And we do this for a couple of reasons. One is to activate prior knowledge from the group who is there. So as teachers, we know that we should start with students where they are and build on their prior knowledge. The same is true for adult learners, where many of them have experienced an inquiry cycle. Even if they don't know exactly what the steps are, they've probably experienced it in their lives somewhere. So we want them to see if they can put together the steps of the inquiry cycle before we present our inquiry cycle, our version, to them. And we also make duplicate cards that have more than one step because sometimes those steps recur. Of course, this idea of collecting data happens toward the beginning, but it also happens as you monitor your progress. And then we have a few blank cards, so participants write in their own steps because many times they have vocabulary or terms that they use that are particular to their context, and we want them to start to make this content familiar to them. So we have them write in their own vocabulary. Let's say they call their team meetings PLCs instead of data teams. So we want them to use the vocabulary that's familiar to them. PLC stands for Professional Learning Community, which is a common term that's being used these days. And then what we'll do is have the participants tape or glue their inquiry cycle to a piece of paper so that they can see it throughout the workshop. And as we go through the steps, we have them check back and say, did you have that step in the same place or in the same order? If so, or if not, why not? And is there a reason for that? Do you have another experience with an inquiry cycle that's really worked for you, and that's why it's in a different order? So it ignites some of that conversation. So that's one of the activities that we start off the workshop with. A second one, which probably many of you have seen because it's widely available out there, is the Data-Driven Dialogue Protocol. This is an older protocol, widely used in different forms, and we like it because it really explicitly moves teachers through the phases of starting with prediction, followed by going visual or looking at a visual display of the data, then starting with observations before moving to inferences and questions. So this is definitely one of our favorite, more widely used protocols. But here's some of the tips that we've thought of as we've gone through. One that I have learned personally is that I like to explain the whole protocol up front and make sure everybody knows what it is. But then I let the participants self-facilitate their way through the protocol, including keeping time and having somebody at the table move them through the phases. And I find this is because when we have multiple teams in the room doing this work all at the same time, it is hard to keep calling them back and announcing that they're in a second phase or the next phase. And it also helps them build facilitation skills. So if you have a team where they're not used to facilitating themselves, it gets them with practice, timekeeping, and playing those different roles. In phase 2, which is go visual, we found it helpful to show examples of effective data visuals. And this is also something that we don't do enough of in education. We have a lot of data that's available in tables or numeric form, but we don't translate those tables or numbers into visuals like charts and graphs that really tell the story in a short amount of time. So we don't encourage skipping over phase 2. In fact, we really encourage spending a lot of time looking at the visuals or creating visuals. So sometimes what we've done is to provide or have that group bring a table of data that they use in their work, maybe a formative assessment set of results, and then have them draw out a visual from that numeric data. And I think they've really noticed the power in looking at the visual. And then we've connected this protocol to other tools that we use that are in the workshop that we're not going to go into here, but one of the ones that I wanted to mention is the ladder of inference. The ladder of inference is a mental model that helps people think about the relationship between the data that you take in with your senses and then the data that you're observing and paying attention to. And at the bottom of the ladder, if you can imagine a ladder going from low to high, at the low end of the ladder is data that is fact, that is presented as observation, that nobody can argue that it's true. But we, as people who make meaning of things, start to add meaning to the data that we see, and we climb the ladder. That's language that we use. We climb the ladder by making inferences and starting to attribute meaning or make judgments based on that data. So we like this protocol because it moves very purposefully through the steps of the ladder of inference, even starting with the idea that we've predicted what we might see, because again, we as people make meaning all the time and we bring our own assumptions to the data. So it honors that. It says, we know you probably have some hypotheses about what you're going to see in this data, so let's talk about them. And then let's go back down the ladder to the visual and see what we observe before we make our inferences. Then the last protocol that we like is the Fishbone diagram. Again, this is an old tool for root cause analysis. It can be used for many different brainstorming activities. So the idea is the spines of the fish, which you can see here, feed into one box at the head of the fish. And I've also seen this done where somebody has put a fish around the fishbone. But you insert all the different possible causes or categories into the spines of the fish, and they contribute to your challenge that you're seeing, that you've observed in the data. One of the facilitation prompts that I would like to emphasize is the importance of sticking with causes that are within the teacher's or the school's control to change. Sometimes when we have practitioners look at this, they immediately think about causes that are outside of their control, outside the school environment, and that is important to recognize, but as a facilitator, it's very necessary to keep them to what can you do as the teacher, what can the school do, instead of trying to make assumptions about those other causes. So that's a facilitation move that we've often emphasized. And then we like the idea of being specific in root causes. So another language issue that I've heard when people talk about this is they'll say things like, we need more as a root cause. Teachers don't have enough professional development. And that will fill up a big box, and people will say, oh, yes, and everybody will nod. But we need to know what that is. Why don't they have enough professional development? And what is the cause of the teacher's lack of knowledge? Not just they need more PD, which is an action. We're not really, in this protocol, we don't want to move to actions. We want to stick in the causes. So prompt them to be specific and provide detail, and then also to model what some of those statements might sound like. We've provided examples. So we've given this diagram with some examples partially filled in and had people react to them and try to figure out how they can model their examples off of ours. So now it's your turn again. We'd love to hear from you because many of you, as I said, have done this work. And Kim, you know, if you are still, I know you're still on the line, if you'd like to tell us what other activities or protocols you have used to help educators look at data, this is a good time to capitalize on the expertise of everybody in the room. And while you are thinking of other protocols or activities that you like, I'm going to look at Heather's question.
Okay. Many of my districts have adapted the Bambrick-Santoyo results meeting protocol. So it's very similar to all of the protocols that Candace presented. I have some districts that do a predicting phase in the beginning, but it's mostly silent observation of the data, and then sharing sharing their observations. So silent review, sharing, and then some time to discuss what they're wondering about the data and actions they might want to try to address what they're seeing in the data. And then the last piece would be coming up with an action plan and executing the action plan with the intent of coming back at a specific time to review the success of the action plan. So that's one that many of my districts have adapted into, and made their own. So that's been nice to see.
Great. Thank you for suggesting that, Kim. I've also looked at the Bambrick-Santoyo resource. I think that's a very popular one out there in the field. There are a couple of questions, and also we want to encourage you to put into the chat protocols or resources that you've used that also help with data analysis, but we will definitely take your questions. Heather's question is about what if there are root causes that are outside of their control, but strategies might be able to address those root causes, like students not doing homework. I think, Heather, this probably goes to this idea of what was your original purpose for looking at the data and coming back to that inquiry question. And if it is to try to understand a student's instructional progress, you might think, okay, this is an issue, but is that really our highest priority right now? Could we focus instead on the classroom and the content in the classroom and the instructional strategies? But if the teachers, want to tackle something like homework, which may or may not be under their control, you could always suggest an action step that starts with trying to solve the homework issue and having them track the data. I mean, I guess it can be part of the inquiry cycle just like anything else. Where I am wary of identifying causes outside of control are the issues that come up with parents, unless you have a really strong partnership with a group that can work with the parents, and that part of your action plan is about including parents as a stakeholder group. I'm a little more wary of root causes that go out into the family unless you have resources to really work with the family as part of an action plan. Heather, feel free to follow up on that question. Nancy, you want to take Patty's question?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the questions. The question Patty asked is, how do schools solve the collaborative planning time, scheduling issues? Are there any tried and true recommendations? I'd actually love to hear from folks who have solved this in the chat as well, so please feel free to add to any information I can share here to support any of you who are dealing with this issue. This is one of the pieces of work I do most often with superintendents, assistant superintendents, and principals to identify where time can be found in the schedule for this. And the answer is different in every single setting. Oftentimes, though, the answer involves taking something off of existing plates. Now that's much easier to say than it is to do in schools. But for instance, in one school where I worked, they developed a collaborative planning time schedule where teachers use the inquiry cycle once a week around some core questions that they kind of set up a little bit in advance. So teachers, in this particular setting, they had a data coach that smoothed this out quite a bit, but teachers would set up an inquiry question that they had for an issue that was in an upcoming unit or series of lessons, and then identify some data sources they wanted to look at. The data coach would collect those data sources and bring them to the next session the following week. The question for that particular school district was what comes off the table, and there were some other things that were being done in that time by teachers that they were tasked with doing that ended up being taken off their plate. And in particular, in this school, some more open-ended conversations that were structured in PLCs but weren't particularly focused on issues of instructional practice. So this was a way to kind of get to the core of what PLCs were originally tasked with doing and adding some protocols and tools in there to allow that to happen. But the bigger question of where do you find time if currently that's not in place is looking very, very closely at schedules and thinking about how resources can be used slightly differently. There are some great books that are out on this, and I can look one up and post one of the answers. There's a particular one that I've used in a number of schools that I can list, and there may be other resources that folks on this webinar know about that could post in the chat as well.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Candace.
David posted a comment in the chat about really understanding the root cause, and I think maybe this also can help if a facilitator is struggling to identify what is that right root cause. You have to think about, is this really where we want to focus our attention and effort? And if it is, we need to collect data to make sure that our actions are having the results that we've intended. So his example is a school had trouble with attendance and thought they would give students alarm clocks, and they had a whole alarm clock campaign that included fundraising and distributing the alarm clocks. And once the students had alarm clocks, the attendance remained the same. So they tackled the wrong root cause. They would have had to go back, let's say, to the Fishbone diagram or something similar that organized their thinking and said this root cause was not our main driving factor. So let's look at what else could be here. And I'll go back to the idea that facilitators should keep track of these documents, that this root cause analysis should live somewhere or be housed somewhere so that if the team decides that this is not the place to put our energy, they can go back and say, we also thought that perhaps it had something to do with the timing of the schedule first thing in the morning, and try an action plan that is related to that. So I think that's a really helpful example. David, thanks for sharing. Full disclosure, I may have stolen the anecdote from a coworker. That's a good one. Another one that I'm not going to go through right now, but if you Google it, I think you can find it, is the anecdote about the Jefferson Memorial and why the paint was crumbling on the Jefferson Memorial. They originally thought they were trying to solve the problem of the paint being crumbling, and they thought that the reason was because of the wrong paint or not enough cleaning, when really it had to do with spiders. So if you want to try to find out what that is, you can Google that anecdote, and it's about trying to find the right root cause for the situation. So we're going to move along and talk to practitioners and setting them up for success in a workshop like this.
Good, and that's me. So as we think about leading this and setting this up at schools, we have a kind of hard and fast rule that this work is done best in teams. And we can say it can work with pairs working together. It does not work with individuals, because the power of this work is really about the shared understanding of what's happening in instruction, what's happening in the classroom, and the opportunity to build from each other's knowledge and to extend their thinking in that way in teams. So we encourage groups of 3 to 5 to do this together. And a message or something that we've seen this in research, we've seen this in our own evaluation data from projects that we've worked on, that it's very helpful to have someone on the team who works with data regularly, who's supporting classroom teachers to do this. Now that may be a data coach. It may be a teacher who's very interested and proficient in working with data. It may just be in several schools where I've worked, we've done specific training for one person on each team in the starting, as they've started off data work, in order to help give them some fluency and confidence to just be kind of a part of the group that's able to help move things forward. The other thing I would say about this particular message around who needs to be at the table is the idea of having someone at the table who has pretty strong content knowledge, and that really helps build capacity as you're looking at responding to issues related to instruction. Generally, we do this work with school-based teams from the same grade level or the same department, and the sort of rule of thumb is same curriculum or same students, right? So that we want there to be some common base, some touchstone that teachers who are participating in this work have that they share on these teams. We have also done this data work across districts at the same grade level. We've also done intentional data work this way with vertical teams, either within the school or across a district. So the ultimate guidance to say how those teams get configured has to do with the questions that you want to ask and the structures that you're able to put in place. So holding on to those ideas as you think about the right structure for you could be helpful. This is something that I mentioned very briefly earlier, and I want to go back to it and just emphasize the point that the inquiry cycle is set up, in this one frame, and it seems like something that you can do at one sitting, and that is true. But it's extremely helpful to work with the group beforehand to think about their inquiry question or their area of focus, and then when the group comes together to make sure that they have that area of, they have data that relates to that particular inquiry question area of focus, and that's developed and aligned for them so that they are using the right data. A big mistake that schools often make is sort of, or especially extant teams that are meeting regularly, they don't necessarily have time to put all the materials together in the beginning, and they come with a question and the data is just kind of a mess and it's not prepared in a way that's quick and easy to look at. So knowing that work in advance really helps with that. And the other key message that is important both, again, from our research and from our practice is thinking about ensuring that you have multiple sources of data to respond to the same question. We know that that gives us much more accurate information. One of the pre-questions that was sent to us was what happens when there's conflicting data, and that actually happens quite a bit. And having those multiple sources of data in one place helps to make sense of that. And if there are 3 or 4 sources of data, that helps to resolve those conflicts in certain ways. And the other thing I would say about what happens when there's conflicting data is what do we know from the most current information we have about student work can often be a tiebreaker, right? We know that data and information about student learning doesn't stay the same because students are continuously learning. And so when we think about how to break a tie in that way, coming back to that information about what we know about current knowledge of students is very important. And then finally, the framing of many schools and districts are using data warehouses or thinking about various sources of data, and so working behind the scenes to make sure that some of this data is available through the warehouses and that everyone has access, or that we know where that is very important to do beforehand. The last thing I want to take away around setting participants up for success is that this work is best done with a plan of action at the end and clarity about how the teams will follow up on this work. And if that's not in place, so especially we see this being an issue in a one-day workshop, if it's not in place before that workshop, by the end of that workshop, really understanding what's going to be next and having real agreed upon follow-up steps for both the participants and leaders of those groups is extremely important and will add a lot to the final work that teachers are able to do with this in the way that they can use this data to inform their instructional practice. And the materials, of course, are publicly available, and as we mentioned earlier, there's a supplemental online course that can help with that. So for those of you who are thinking about getting some more step-by-step information before you lead this, that's there for you. And as well, if your teachers are interested in doing that work to help lead some of these conversations, that's available for them as well. And I'm actually interested in looking at the chat and seeing some things that are in there. But this is a good time as we come towards the end of our workshop for folks to have an opportunity to ask some final questions. And also if there's any questions that you have for Kim, that would be helpful to hear about as well. I see that there's some conversation going on about DataWise. Candace, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So Teresa had mentioned that she's using DataWise, which is a resource that was published back in, I think, 2008, and then from the folks over at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I've used it quite extensively. I've done a lot of work with that group. And what I like about DataWise that is, I think, unique is they include explicitly a step about examining evidence of instruction. And that's something that I would encourage everybody to consider as they go through the inquiry cycle, something that's often missing, especially when you're looking at root cause. People often assume something is happening in a classroom, or as a teacher, I assume something that is happening in my classroom is happening in other classrooms, and that may not be true. And so looking at evidence of instruction is a good way to determine whether your root cause is actually accurate. Somebody in the pre-webinar questions asked, how do we take this to the next level? We feel comfortable. We've been doing this for a while. So what I would say is I would look at whether you are examining instruction as part of your data routine. If you feel comfortable looking at the paper form and student work, if you feel comfortable in a collaborative meeting, having conversations, go into classrooms and take some descriptive evidence, non-judgmental, and see if what you see in classrooms matches what you were thinking as part of your root cause analysis. I will say, though, examining instruction is a very important but difficult thing to establish if you don't have that culture of trust in a building, especially since many people conflate classroom observation with observing for evaluation. And so you do have to establish norms about why people are going into classrooms, that they're not there to judge, and that they're there to take descriptive evidence and not evaluative evidence before you start that process. So that's my one, I guess, key point that I'd emphasize if anybody's interested in taking a look at instruction. Nancy, any other comments you'd like to respond to in the chat?
No, I don't see any. I know that our next piece is also a chat discussion, so I'll put that up now. And we've been having that discussion, so I think this is really helpful if there's anyone else who wants to add to this. Do you currently use resources like this at your site? Candace really was just responding to this question, is how well do these support teachers to connect data to instruction? And for me, that is also the biggest question. And I have, I think the question Heather posed earlier to say, how do you keep people from straying off or coming up with root causes or solutions that would be kind of off topic? This really does speak to the facilitator's role, and one of the pieces that didn't get answered around that is how the use of protocols help specifically to really keep the focus on instruction. Because I think it's easy for teachers to come up with inquiry questions that speak to instructional issues and really speak to their need and interest in wanting to find out more about the instructional side. But it's harder then to sort of make those links at the other end, and I think that's what the protocols do as well. So I'd add that to the mix in there.
I'm curious to know if anybody has questions for Kim, given the work that she does routinely in schools, or Kim, if you have any reflections having listened to the rest of the webinar on the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and
I think everything
Kim.
you've said, ties into the work that I'm trying to do, and it's a work in progress, and I'm sure our audience can attest to that. It's change is hard and change takes time, so I like to celebrate the small victories, the small changes as much as I possibly can. And I think the teachers, if they can start to see the connections, they can start to see the improvement, it just builds on, them continuing to want to look at the information. So I guess I've certainly been involved in all these different phases that you're discussing, and I just keep plugging away and fighting the good fight, and we're getting there. It's been a slow process, but I'm very confident. I've seen a lot of growth in my districts, and that makes me really happy. So we're just going to keep doing it and continue to see the improvement for our kids, and that's the bottom line in my opinion.
There's a question, Kim, that I'd love to have you tackle if you're willing to, and it's about those different levels of what I often hear as buy-in, when people aren't sure what the value is, or if some people see the value and other people don't. I know that I've encountered that frequently. I think one suggestion that I would make in terms of buy-in is I think buy-in sometimes means different things when teachers say that. Sometimes it means they don't know what to do, and as a result they might appear resistant because they just don't know. And I think having a routine and then having a set of protocols makes it clear why we're looking at the data and that this data is connected to actions that we're going to take. So again, back to the value of really reinforcing the data routine, it clarifies the process for people. It's not mysterious. There are 5 steps. We're going to go through all 5 steps. Each step has a protocol, and at the end, we're going to take some instructional action. So I think this question of buy-in is funny because people say that, and sometimes I wonder what they mean. Does it mean that people just don't know what they're doing, and therefore they don't know how to react, or they don't see the value in it? And I think clarifying the process goes a long way to that. Do you have any other thoughts about this issue of buy-in?
I think sometimes they don't know what they don't know. So, for instance, here in New York, we have 3 through 8 testing and we have Regents exams, and there are a lot of data reports related to these assessments, but teachers don't always know that the information's out there. So I find when I can get these reports in front of them and explain how to read them and let them interpret them and analyze them, it's like a light bulb goes off because they don't even know this is out there. And then they can have conversations and they can start to think about what are these reports telling us and how can we use this information to help the kids that are in front of us today. So that's been a lot of my work is raising awareness about what we have available that people don't even know about. And, I think that's part of the problem sometimes, in my opinion, in my experience.
Yes, I agree. Having access and facilitating that access is another role potentially for a facilitator, somebody who is behind the scenes a little bit and working to make sure that they know where the reports are, make sure the data is gathered, and making sure people are aware of the resources. So that's another key role for a facilitator.
Yeah,
let me just turn it over to Nancy. She's going to talk a little bit about the next facilitation webinar we have coming up, sponsored by the Regional Educational Laboratory on October 8th.
Yeah, so the next webinar that we'll be doing together, Candace and I will be leading, and we'll have Kim with us as well, is a skill builder workshop on a resource that the REL developed called the Culture of Data Use. I saw in the registration that many of you have co-registered. We're going to have a format similar to this one, but the topic of culture of data use is very different, and the workshop itself is very different. It is a research to practice kind of workshop, and it's more for leaders of the process, thinking about how would I set up a system that supports developing a culture of data use. So it's much more than just using data. It also involves what are the strategies and approaches that leaders need to have in buildings and in districts to support data use. What are some issues around storing and keeping data? How do we think about content development and helping teachers use college and career ready standards in the process of data use and building their content knowledge in that area? And how do all these things fit together? So we've developed a framework from that data, and we found it really helpful just to provide a mental model, I suppose, of how to organize your district around developing effective data use practices overall and building a culture of inquiry and a culture of data use at schools. So that'll be October 8th, and the 3 of us will be back for that. So we encourage you to participate in that. And again, our format will be the same, but the content is quite different. So our little plug for that coming up.
Yes. We hope to see you back at that time.
Yeah.
So we are at the end of our session today, and it is very important to us that we get your feedback on how this webinar went for you. So there's 2 ways you can access the link. One of them is in the pod that is underneath the attendee list. There's a link to the SurveyMonkey, and then it's been posted several times in the chat. And then I also think that this link on your slides is live. But before you leave us, please take the survey and give us your feedback. It does help us improve our own practice, and it would be remiss for me to talk about the data inquiry cycle and not talk about the importance of data gathered at the end of an activity and using that to improve future activities. So it is extremely important to us for you to fill out these evaluation forms, and thank you in advance for doing that. So on behalf of myself and Nancy and Kim, we would love to thank you for joining us today, and also from the entire team from the Regional Educational Laboratory at Northeast Islands. And thanks so much, and we'll hopefully see you on October 8th for the Facilitating the Culture of Data Use webinar. If you do have any questions, feel free to email us. And it was really great to spend this time with you this afternoon.